Welcome to Dig Deep, the mining podcast. In this podcast, we go deep into mining news, hot topics, and live interviews with mining professionals and leading figures in the mining industry. Introducing your host, Rob Tyson, founder and director of Mining International and Mining International Executive, a leading global mining recruitment and headhunting agency.
Hi, mining community. Welcome back to another episode of the Dig Deep, the mining podcast. And today's guest is Brian Menell, who's the chairman and CEO of TechMet's, who acquires and manages projects that produce, processes and recycles the critical metals that are key components of batteries, electric vehicles and renewable energy systems across a range of commodities, including cobalt, lithium, nickel, tin, tungsten, rare earth metals. Brian is a businessman who has over 25 years experience and been involved in the energy and natural resources projects across Africa, South and North America and Europe, and founded TechMet's back in 2017. He's on the podcast today and he's going to be speaking about the growth of TechMet's, their work that they've been doing, especially with the US government, and the importance of securing critical mineral supply chains across the world. Brian's also going to be speaking and attending at the upcoming London Indaba at the InterContinental Park Lane on the 25th and 26th of June, so in a couple of days' time, where the event's title is Investing in Resources in Mining in Africa. And obviously the conference is a focus on Africa's critical role in the minerals and metals of the future. I'll put a link in the comments, so anyone attending, or if you're looking to attend the event, you can purchase tickets. So hopefully, obviously, see you there. Welcome, Brian. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks, Rob. Thank you very much for having me on.
No, appreciate your time as well. I know you've obviously been traveling a lot recently, and you're obviously back in London at the moment. So I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your career. I imagine a lot of people listening to this podcast may know you or may have spoken to you in the past, but for those that haven't come across you, just wondering if you just tell us a little bit about your career.
Sure. I've been in metals and mining all of my working life. I come from South Africa. My family was involved historically in a range of metals, mining, processing and industrial activities, which we sold out of in the early 2000s. In 2017, as you mentioned, I founded TechMet's as a vehicle to invest in and build projects across the middle portion of the value chain for the critical minerals feeding the energy transition. And that for me was such an overwhelmingly obvious zone of opportunity that I sold and exited from everything else that I had been doing over the previous decade, largely natural resources projects in private vehicles around Africa, in order to focus exclusively on the strategy, which is now all that I do from a personal investment point of view, and obviously from a time and focus point of view.
So I wondered if you could just tell us about TechMet's, obviously that you founded 7-8 years ago, and I suppose your motivation behind founding the company.
Yeah, I mean, the motivation is fairly self-evident. We're in the early stages of a global energy transition with a growingly pressing imperative of mitigating climate change. And that involves a total transformation of mobility towards electric mobility, total transformation of electric generation and grids in the direction of renewable energy systems. And all of that is very minor metal intensive for batteries, for electric motors, etc., and for grid infrastructure. And therefore, it was quite obvious then, and is even more obvious now, that we're at the beginning of a 20-year supply-demand dislocation for lithium-ion battery metals, for rare earth metals, for energy infrastructure metals, that is really unprecedented in our lifetimes. In fact, probably more severe than any other supply-demand dislocation we've seen for any mined product since the impact on demand for coal and iron ore in the first industrial revolution in the late 19th, late 18th and early 19th centuries. So this area of value creation opportunity is really an enormously compelling opportunity, and the needs for our industry to transform in terms of volumes, in terms of standards, in terms of geopolitical independence from China, who's built an overwhelmingly dominant position across these global supply chains, is very, very pressing imperative and very, very exciting and accelerating opportunity.
You're not a passive investment vehicle. What do you look for in a company when making, obviously, investment decisions? And I suppose beyond the financing element, how does TechMet work to add value to its portfolio of companies?
Well, we're a private critical minerals investment company. So we invest in private projects and companies, either to fund the expansion of existing production or late-stage development projects through to production. And we do this across mining, processing, refining, and recycling. And we presently have 10 operating companies around North America, South America, Africa, and Europe, and cover, in our view, not all the metals in the energy, feeding the energy transition, but the key ones with the most severe medium-term shortages and most dominant Chinese control over global supply. So when we're looking at investments, either to further our investment in our existing projects, some of which we control, some of which we're just dominant minorities, we look for projects that produce our metals in a way that can be transparent and with high ESG standards and low carbon footprint, where we can develop production independently of Chinese control, which part of our rationale and strategy is to be on the side of US, European supply chains to balance China's position. And we look for low-cost production, and we look to support transformative technologies that unlock resources that need to be developed in order to meet this medium-term structural short supply. So, there are a whole matrix of criterion we employ, but essentially those are the key drivers of our strategy and hence our investment decisions. We are part owned by the US government, so we do adhere to very high ESG standards and do undertake to give preference to US supply chains and those of US economic allies. And obviously we invest in projects with strong management teams who we can have high confidence in not only their capacity to execute and deliver, but their ethical and ESG standards.
Can you highlight any of the projects or operations that you're currently involved in?
They're reasonably diverse. 4 of our 10 operating companies are in the US, and almost half of our value is in the US, so we're quite US-centric. However, our biggest single project is Brazilian nickel, where we have funded and built the first commercial plant producing a mixed hydroxide precipitate of nickel and cobalt from the heap leaching of this particular type of laterite resource, which we have pioneered over the last 10 years to do cheaply, low carbon footprint, low environmental impact. And we're now busy securing a $1.5 billion funding package for the large-scale expansion of that project. So that's very important. We're expanding our tin and tungsten mines in Rwanda. We're preparing to build substantial rare earth separated oxide production from the processing of waste dumps from the old phosphate mines in South Africa. In the States, we're pioneered direct lithium extraction from geothermal brines, which we're busy funding the large-scale expansion of in California. So across all of our assets, there's a lot of activity and a lot of development, and we're continuing to accelerate our funding programs as we have greater means to fund as TechMet, and we are busy in the process of completing a further $300 million equity raise at the TechMet level in order to continue to accelerate all of those programs across our presently 10 operating assets.
TechMet is the only metals and mining company to have direct equity investment from the US government. What does that mean for the company?
It's been enormously important for us. We got the first direct equity investment in 2020 from the DFC as a US government funding agency, and then again follow-on investments, equity investments in 22 and 23. And we're busy with further funding from the DFC, both at the TechMet level and debt at the project level. So it's been massively important for us, not only in terms of the quantum of investment, but in terms of the de-risking and credentializing impact of US government investment and the uniqueness of it. You know, we have the strange distinction of being the only metals and mining company ever in history to have direct US government equity investment. And that's opened up a lot of other sources of funding at the TechMet level and at the asset level, and allowed us to really very considerably accelerate that program and given us a degree of preferential access to other US government departments, such as the DOE loan program, such as Exim Bank, such as the Department of Defense, all of whom we're busy with at the project level to further accelerate the development of our production and supply, of all of these critical minerals.
And I suppose some audience may be asking, how did you get to that position where you were liaising with the government and they were then willing to invest, especially if you have been the only company that the US government has invested in?
Yeah, we've been, ever since 2017, when I founded TechMet, we have done so in consultation with elements of the ecosystem in Washington to ensure that we were well positioned to participate in what we all saw as being inevitable with respect to acceleration of US government agency engagement in critical mineral supply chain security. So from inception, we chose to be China-free in China-dominated industries. We chose to have very high ESG standards and transparency, all of which have been necessary requirements for the funding and support and partnerships we've received from DFC and are busy with other US government agencies. So why the world needs, and I would have expected the world to have 20 of us yesterday. So, why we have been relatively uniquely positioned is, I'm not sure, but we've done the right things at the right time, somewhat ahead of the wave.
Why should securing critical metal supply chains be at the top of everyone's agenda right now? Obviously, we hear a lot in the news, but why do you think everyone should be focusing on this?
Well, two reasons. One is, if we want to meet climate change goals, we need a lot more electric cars and a lot more wind turbines and a lot more solar cells and a lot more on-grid and off-grid battery storage. And all of that requires multiples of the present global supply of lithium and nickel and rare earth metals and tin and other metals and copper. And the efficiency of scalability of supply from the mining industry and the metals processing industry is very inadequate. And therefore, there will be continual short supplies of these critical inputs over the next 3, 5, 10, 15 years. And therefore, doing everything we can to bridge that gap and do it responsibly is a really key imperative from a climate change mitigation point of view. It's also a key imperative as the energy transition accelerates, of industrial competitiveness in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere, and hence a key ingredient of economic growth and jobs, given how industries are shifting in a cleaner energy direction. The other element of the equation and the imperative of the focus on the space is China's position and the geopolitics and national security considerations inherent in critical mineral supply chains. And China has, over the last 15 years or 20 years, built up an overwhelmingly dominant position while everybody was sleeping. And this has massive implications for European, US, and other non-Chinese countries' national security, and as I've mentioned, economic growth and industrial competitiveness. So on both of those fronts, it really deserves to be a very, very high priority in everybody's minds.
Short-term commodity cycles obviously can have a long-term impact on the sector. How do fluctuations in critical mineral critical mineral prices impact TechMet and the industry overall?
They impact us both negatively and positively. If you look at it as an example, the present nickel market, it's been very depressed relative to an excessively speculative spike in prices 2.5 years ago. It's been depressed partially because the perception of growth and demand from EVs and from Chinese economic demand have slowed. It's been depressed because the funding environment is much tougher with higher inflation and higher interest rates than it was. And it's depressed because the Chinese have accelerated their investment in Indonesian nickel supply, and therefore there's a reality of short-term oversupply and a perception of medium-term oversupply, which is incorrect. So as a result, you've got low nickel prices and a very tough funding environment for non-Chinese nickel projects. So that's difficult for us because we have to fund at the TechMet level, we have to fund at the project level in order to continue to accelerate. But it's great for us if we are one of the few parties that can fund, because we can deploy capital much more aggressively, while the medium-term outlook is becoming more and more compelling and more exciting, because the medium-term shortage of nickel, 3, 4, 5 years out, is growing every day, because a lot of people are slowing down or scrapping projects that need to be built to meet that demand. And it's growing every day because Chinese dominance over the supply chain is growing every day because they're not slowing down their investment programs. But even if they do everything they claim they're going to do in Indonesia, that is only going to cover half the demand shortfall in 4 or 5 years' time. So we are really, provided we can continue to fund, we're very, very excited for TechMet and very, very concerned for US and European industry in terms of availability of supply to feed these new industries, and obviously in terms of reliance on Chinese-dominated supply chains.
Obviously, ESG is an important question for obviously all market participants and everyone in our mining industry, and obviously looking at critical mineral supply chains. How do you factor this into your decisions and obviously when making investments?
Yeah, we only invest in projects that have the potential to uphold high ESG standards and low carbon footprint in regions where we can ensure that is the case. And we only invest in projects with management teams who are committed to those standards. It is a necessary element of the transformation of our industry to feed the energy transition that we do so responsibly and with high standards. Otherwise, we are feeding a climate change mitigation on flimsy foundations and with supply chains that don't embody the values that we are, as an industry and as a world hoping to uphold and build on. So it is absolutely crucial, and increasingly it's demanded by end users, automakers and others who want traceable and clean and responsible supply chains to underpin their energy transition and clean and responsible consumer products. And increasingly it's a differentiator that gives you preferential access to market and preferential access to financing to counter Chinese supply chains, which generally have lower standards or over which the Chinese state imposes less rigorous environmental standards.
You're going to be speaking at the upcoming London Indaba event. What's your talk going to be about and centered around?
The topic of the panel is focused largely on beneficiation, taking mined resources in Africa, because it's an African conference, and turning them into high purity battery metal chemicals and other higher value products to feed global industry, as opposed to just exporting concentrates out of Africa to China or elsewhere for them to be turned into high value products. And that's a very, very interesting and very important topic, and a very difficult topic. It's very difficult to compete with China in specialty metal chemical processing. And to do that in a way that doesn't retard investment in primary resource extraction, which is where a lot of the value creation is for African and other resource-rich countries in terms of growth, economic activity, economic spin-off, and employment. So it's a tricky balance that is certainly worthy of very clear-minded discussion.
And lastly, what's the outlook for TechMet over the next sort of 6 to 12 months?
We've, as I mentioned, we're busy, hopefully in the coming weeks, closing our present $300 million funding round, which will put us in a strong position to accelerate our investment programs across all of our assets, all of which are in expansion or development phases, at the same time as adding selectively to our portfolio with projects that are synergistic to our existing projects, technologies, and portfolio, and and obviously to our overall strategy. So we are intending to hopefully build on the plus or minus of $1 billion of assets we have today to create multiple billions of dollars of value and relevance to well-governed global critical mineral supply chains over the next 1, 2, 3, 5 years and beyond.
Brian, thank you for your time. Really appreciate you giving us an update on TechMet and what you've achieved over this time, and obviously looking at the future and what you're looking to do in on mining industry, especially in the critical metal space. If our audience wants to follow your story and obviously see what you're up to and how TechMet is obviously progressing, how can they do that? What social media platform channels are you
we
on?
have a LinkedIn account, we have a Twitter account, we have a website of TechMet.com. We are a private company, and therefore there's not quite as much in the public domain as would be the case for a public company, but nonetheless we will put out news through those channels, when there are key relevant developments in our programs, in our assets, and in our overall development of TechMet.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Again, hope to see you at the London Indaba event next week. Those that are listening, appreciate your continued support. Please keep sharing this episode far and wide. Obviously, it's an important subject, the critical minerals space, and Brian's obviously alluded to what they're doing to push this agenda along and get these metals into obviously production, so we can produce more and more batteries, and obviously for the electric and green revolution that is coming up ahead of us. So appreciate your time. Please keep sharing this episode far and wide, and until next time, happy mining.
Thank you for listening. Remember to reach out to Rob via the show notes, and be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Until next time, happy mining, helping each other to improve the mining industry.